Okay, so what we're going to talk about today then is the elements of literature, or what it is that makes a good story. So the first thing we want to talk about is the fact that we read literature because it helps us give order to the human experience. In other words, by reading stories about other people, it helps us better understand how human beings interact with each other, both within our own culture and country and globally. It also helps us explore cultural values because people that live in the Middle East do not have the same values as the people that live in Canada, that do not have the same values as the people that live in Russia. So it helps us understand the way other people live their lives. When we read good literature, we often get an emotional response from it. When we read Hunger Games last year, we were shocked that they would put kids in an arena and have them kill each other. Okay, so we get emotional responses from good books. And reading is like a great journey. It can show us things we've never seen before and things we will never forget. It can take us to places we cannot go, like the past or the future, or it can take us to places in the world that we'll never get to. So in order for literature to be really good, we have to understand the elements of plot development. Now the plot is the story. It's what happens in the book. So if an author writes, the king died and then the queen died, we have no plot for the story. But if the author writes, the king died and then the queen died of grief, we have been provided with a plot line. So simply by adding those two words, we now have a story. So the plot is how the author arranges the basic idea. So that's how they arrange the events and they develop that idea. And you'll notice on your study guide, it says right at the top of the page that how the author arranges events in a logical sequence to develop his basic idea into a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we're talking about the order of which things happen in a story. It's planned, it's logical, and of course we have the beginning, the middle, and the end. So what is it that goes into plot? Well, the information that's needed to understand the story is called the exposition. And the exposition is the character development and the setting. Look at your study guides. Do you see where it says character development and setting is? You're going to write down the red word, exposition. The complication is the catalyst that begins the major conflict. Catalyst means it's what starts it. It's the cause. So the complication is called the problem or the conflict in the story, and we call it complication. Okay? When you were younger, we used to say, what is the problem in the story? When you got a little older, we said, what is the conflict? Well, now we're even older yet, and we call it the complication. So think about it like this. Things are getting complicated in the story, right? We have a problem. Rising action is where the events in the story begin to start building, and we find out what the conflict is. So what is it that's causing problems for our characters? In short stories, we typically have one complication or one conflict. In novels, we can have many conflicts related to the complication. So as you get older and as you find out more about literature, you start to see that we develop a greater sense of understanding because it's broken down into even bigger parts or smaller parts. The climax of the story, or the climactic moment of the story, is the turning point. It's where this occurs when the characters try to resolve the complication, and everything that has been happening in the story up to that point kind of hits a peak, and all of a sudden we have a turning point. So I'll go back to the example of Hunger Games. In Hunger Games, I know you guys have seen the movie. In the story Hunger Games, everything in the story builds up to the moment where Katniss and Peeta decide to eat the poisonous berries, and they're both going to die, and there's no winner of the games. That is the climax of the story. It is not the end of the story, but it is what everything in the story has been building up to. Okay? The falling action is when the events and the complications begin to resolve themselves. We don't have resolution yet. The story is not over, but we see things that are starting to happen to bring the resolution about. Some stories do not have falling action. There's a climax, a resolution, and it's over. The climax of the story, this is very important to remember. The climax of the story comes towards the very end of the story. It does not come in the middle of the story. Oftentimes, students will confuse the climax of the story with the resolution, or they confuse the climax of the story with just something big that happens in the story. Okay? Resolution, however, is the final outcome that brings the story to a close. When we get to resolution, we now have the answer to the conflict, to the complication. Okay? In The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, the complication is Bruno moved to the camp at Auschwitz, and he met Shmuel. That's the complication. He's living at this camp. The resolution is the boys became really good friends and ended up, right? And remember what happened to them? Yeah, they ended up in the gas chamber. So the complication was they were separated by a fence, and the resolution was they were able to be together in the end. Okay?